This is a very special edition of the Geopolitics and Empire podcast. We have our guest here. We're speaking with Joanna Lillis, who is the author of the recently published Dark Shadows Inside the Secret World of Kazakhstan. She's been living in the Soviet and former Soviet space for almost 30 years now, half of that time in Kazakhstan. She writes for The Economist, The Guardian, The Independent, EurasiaNet, Foreign Policy, Politico, and many other publications. And it's special because I think you're based in Almaty, yeah?
Yeah.
And so I'm here in remote, kind of rural Kazakhstan in Semey. And I had been meaning to visit her in Almaty, but I was checking my Twitter feed and I saw her posting photos from Semey. And so just the way things come together. And so, this is special. And so thanks for coming on the program.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And I don't have the physical book, but I bought on Kindle, so you can see Dark Shadows on Kindle. And it's one of the first books of its kind, I think, in English discussing Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
And so my first question is, the goal of this talk is really to kind of dig into your experience and your life here, get some of your insights and share with listeners what Kazakhstan is all about before Nazarbayev, during, and now post-Nazarbayev. Yeah. So it's really a historic moment to be here. Like 2 weeks ago, it was... Couldn't believe to hear the news. After 30 years, he's formally stepping down. And you've spoken to people from all walks of life in Kazakhstan, I think including those in power, yes? Some?
Yeah, some. Mm-hmm.
So, we want to get the good, the bad, and the ugly. And, one thing I've learned living now in 6 countries is that in every single country you have advantages that others don't in their political structure, economic system, social and cultural traditions, as well as you have bad things. So, I think your book was very objective. It looked at positive and negative sides. And, I don't want to spend too much time on the older history of Kazakhstan because people can read about that and especially get your book. You have the first part of the book deals with that and throughout the book. One thing that hit me as an American living here is that I never realized how much of a deep presence and influence the Russian Empire and Soviet Union had. Always from the West, we've heard, you kind of had this vague idea of Soviet Union and Russia, but living here, I never realized it's been hundreds of years. The language that was imposed and before the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, and you can still feel very visibly this influence. And then, you have the issues with the language, the mass government migration of the ethnic populations, the gulags, the killings, and even though, and still some people are nostalgic for the Soviet Union. So maybe to start, you can tell us some of the more relevant points for you to set the context and get across regarding the Kazakh history from the days of the Russian Empire until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, what might you tell us that's most important to set the context?
Right, that's a good question. I think this question of the Russian influence on Kazakhstan, it's really, absolutely massive, this influence. I don't think anybody would really deny that. We hear a lot these days about Chinese influence, but the influence of Russia, political, economic, cultural, linguistic, it's really, stamped on Kazakhstan. And of course, here in Semey, we really feel it, walking around the streets and looking at the buildings, you can really see this Russian colonial influence, Soviet and Russian as well. So I think, it's not something you can at all underestimate. I think, it's something that's sensitive, I think, to some people, especially to many Kazakhs who like to kind of see a bit more reassessment of the Soviet past and the Russian colonial past. Even these days in Russia, there are many people who don't actually see Russia as a colonizer, who believe that Russia came to help the other Soviet post-Soviet countries, what are now post-Soviet countries. But we also see the sensitivities that Russia has towards any attempt to revisit the history that was handed down by the Soviets, basically, at this point. For example, only last week, the new president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, was in Moscow, and they wrote into their joint declaration that there should be no attempts to falsify and to rewrite history, was what they actually wrote. So you can see that this is top of Moscow's agenda, if you like. And I think the difficulties that can bring are that it means that it's very difficult to have an objective conversation about the past, a realistic conversation about the past. I mean, I've been visiting the museums in Semey the last couple of days, and there are so many glaring omissions. Really, some small in the main museum. There's just a little bit about Semipalatinsk, it's the test site, but there's nothing about when it opened, why it opened, how many nuclear explosions took place there, and what was the impact on people's health, which we know was absolutely massive. So I think this question of Russia, it's a really, really big influence on Kazakhstan.
And maybe you can tell us about another topic that's still relevant to this day, and something that I was surprised coming here, the different ethnic groups living here. There's so many, the Kazakhs, the Russians, the Germans, the Tatars, and maybe if you just want to comment on the ethnic dynamics, what's most important for you to highlight here. I find it fascinating that a third of Kazakhs don't speak the language at all or very well.
Mm-hmm. The ethnic dynamics is something that I find hugely interesting, and I tried to bring it out in Dark Shadows because I think that the impact on the psyche, if you like, of the Kazakhs, because of the massive transformations, ethnographic, demographic transformations that took place over the course of really just a few decades, from the late 19th century through the Stalin period especially. I mean, there was these huge impacts that if you look at the figures, in the but just before the turn of the century, Kazakhs were around 90% of the population, and then by in the 30s, because of all the things that happened in the Stalin period in the 30s and 40s, from a famine that we don't know how many people it killed, but we know it was probably at least 1 million or possibly up to 2 million. And most of those people were Kazakhs who were killed in the famine, and also the deportations that were undertaken, whole peoples transported from other parts of the Soviet Union, so a sort of punitive measure, if you like, under Stalin, before, during and after World War II. And all of that, ended up driving Kazakhs into a minority in Kazakhstan. And I think that really reverberates in people's mentality to this day. I mean, and going back to what we were kind of saying about history, I think that there are people who are resentful that an open discussion of this is not held in Kazakhstan. Some post-Soviet countries are having that discussion, some are not. In Kazakhstan, it's very sensitive. Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, when he was president, would constantly say Russia was Kazakhstan's number one foreign policy partner, number one priority. Basically, you could say Kazakhstan's Russia's closest ally. So how can they reassess this history? But really, it does have an enormous impact on the way people feel, and there are resentments about this to this day, including the fact, as you mentioned, that many people in Kazakhstan don't speak Kazakh. And this is not so much the case in some other post-Soviet countries, that the local language was so eroded. I mean, there are many reasons for that. One being the massive influx of people from elsewhere that made Russian a lingua franca. Mm-hmm. And people still resent that now, understandably as well. And I think what we could also say is there's a big failing in the education system, because I constantly meet young people who leave school without a proper grasp of Kazakh.
Mm-hmm. That's slowly changing. So,
good.
And you mentioned the nuclear tests, and so I wanted to talk about that as well. We're here in Semey, which is 120 kilometers from the Polygon, the nuclear test site, where was the principal Soviet nuclear test site, which, by the way, I'm going to visit soon for the first time. I'm going to go visit the actual test site. And something maybe people don't know, that you can actually go visit in Nevada as well. The U.S. government, every month they allow about 20 to 30 people to go visit the test site in America.
Okay.
So I mean, I'm wanting to do that someday as well. I'm interested in the history. But in your book, you know, I think your last chapter talks about this, and you talk about some of the wider effects to this day, you know, are still unknown. There's still research that needs to be done, and we still don't know. But you know, definitely a lot of people suffered. I think Nazarbayev said that from 500,000 to 1.5 million people suffered, and you know, the genes were mutated, so they're passed down the line. So someone who was affected at the time, you know, maybe they weren't affected, but then their child has problems, or maybe their child doesn't have problems, but their grandchild. So it goes down the line. So maybe if you could just tell us briefly, you know, what sticks out for you regarding the test site. And you mentioned that, is this true that scientists say that a lot of the land will be salvageable by next year, 2020?
This was said. Yeah, I mean, obviously there was this enormous impact on human health, and on people's lives. People's lives were destroyed. I mean, because of that. I mean, children born disabled. In Dark Shadows, I interviewed the mother of a second generation of victim of nuclear testing. In other words, the young woman was born after the testing had stopped, but she is still identified as being severely disabled, both physically and mentally, because of the impact of that testing that's happened. It ceased before she was even born. So it's you know, it's really terrifying, actually, how little regard, I guess, the Soviets had for the health of the people around them. There are conflicting views, of course, on whether the Soviets deliberately use people as sort of guinea pigs to see what the effect would be. I mean, I think most people, probably most reliable scientists, have their doubts that this was really the case. It was more a sort of, perhaps, I don't know, but it was perhaps more a disregard that the Soviet state was very much about you know, always putting the state first, the collective, over the individual. And yet, you know, what we see now is you know, the destruction of people's lives. I mean, the person that I'm talking about, who I interviewed in the book, she ended up has now spent her whole life, or nearly the past 30 years, looking after her disabled daughter. We hear a lot from Nursultan Nazarbayev, who recently resigned as president, about Kazakhstan giving up nuclear weapons voluntarily at the fall of the Soviet Union. Very laudable, of course. Also, under Nazarbayev, you know, a moratorium was placed on nuclear testing at Semipalatinsk, and then the site was closed down at independence. But we hear a lot about this. It's something that Kazakhstan uses to show itself as a force for good on the international stage, and also to counteract criticism over negatives as well in its human rights record. But you know, I was very struck when I came to do some research for the book and meet some of the victims and their parents who have to look after them. I was very struck by actually how little assistance they do get. You know, what they get is basically a smallish disability allowance. Kazakhstan did pay out some compensation, the government, in the 90s after independence. And you have to say that is a good thing, because it wasn't Kazakhstan that caused the problem. It was Moscow, but Moscow just walked away from the problem. Okay, but Kazakhstan did pay out quite small amounts of compensation, and of course all of that is long since spent, and now people are surviving on a disability allowance of maybe a couple of $100 a month. But of course somebody has to be a full-time carer for these people, also striking, of course, yeah, we it's very difficult to say what the long-term impact of the tests, how long it's going to last. I mean, we have seen these quite astonishing forecasts that, as you mentioned, that a lot of the land would be salvageable and perfectly harmless by 2020. I think that forecast was probably made about a decade, ago. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I do find that quite astonishing. I mean, can this really be the case? Of course, Kazakhstan has a very respected and well-developed civilian nuclear industry. So I guess they do know what they're talking about. Let's hope so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I came, I brought a Geiger counter. I was kind of fearful, but it seems in the city in Sumy things are all right. So no problems here.
Okay.
So we'll see when I get to that test site. We have to purchase the protection when you get to the test site, and so let's talk about the president or former president now, Nursultan Nazarbayev, and if you can perhaps help us understand a little bit of who he is, because there are many people here who truly support him and like him, but as well you have people who, though they may not like him, they support him because he, for the sake of stability. And then of course you have people that don't like the President Nazarbayev. And, it's also interesting, I've met many people who are just disinterested or indifferent regarding Nazarbayev and all the politics. And they just want to go about their lives. And so, how would you, give us this glimpse of who is Nursultan Nazarbayev?
Right. Well, that's a big question, I think, for Kazakhstan. I mean, this is a man. I hope I tried to show this in Dark Shadows, a towering personality who has just stamped his personality and his politics and policies on Kazakhstan, in a very strong, powerful way. Now, clearly, he's a very astute politician. I think his rise in politics in Soviet times probably shows us that. I mean, this is a person who started off as a steel worker, was born in rural Kazakhstan, and has previously described himself as a son and grandson of shepherds, although I believe that there were some people in his family who were a bit more powerful than that. But this is a person who rose up through the ranks in the Soviet Union. He has said after the fall of the Soviet Union that he basically became a communist because he was very ambitious and that was the way to get ahead. In fact, he said that he would have become a Buddhist if that had been what it took. And I think that's probably, we don't always believe what politicians say in public, but I think that's probably true. He was clearly a very ambitious person and he rose right through the ranks, soon leaving manual work behind eventually. I mean, it was a tough job being a steel worker in the 50s in the Soviet Union. But he became a party cadre, Communist Party, and he was really rising pretty fast. He was on the Politburo, sitting in Moscow, as well as becoming, of course, the Soviet leader of Kazakhstan, the first secretary in 1989, chosen by Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, when he wanted to bring a new broom. So at that time, Nazarbayev, young, ambitious, and tipped for greater things even until the Soviet Union collapsed. And then, of course, thrust into, independence, independent Kazakhstan, which at the time was quite as well as being maybe, a welcome and exciting opportunity, it was also a terrifying one because the economy was collapsing, people were protesting, you had a big industrial workforce, you had a huge Russian minority, Kazakhs in a minority still in their own country, or, all of this was a massive challenge, and obviously to some degree Nazarbayev rose to that challenge, and he's also made himself very popular, as you mentioned, among some people who do prize some of the things that he has given the country, if you like. I mean, they're a bit of a mantra sometimes, an official mantra, things like ethnic harmony. It's true that Kazakhstan does have over 100 ethnic groups, and they do rub along remarkably peacefully, really, considering, what we see in other post-Soviet countries sometimes. And of course, stability is another mantra, and people prize that. Now, you could argue that stability is used as a way of making people fearful of change, wanting to keep that political system that Nazarbayev has built. So Nazarbayev has a lot of fans, a lot of acolytes in Kazakhstan. That's absolutely definite. I mean, I've talked to so many people over these years, 14 years now in reporting from Kazakhstan, especially at election time. So I'm already getting out and talking to people because we now have another election, but of course no Nazarbayev this time. And the other thing, though, that there's a lot of talk. We do see he has his fans, and they prize some of the achievements that he's helped to bring about or brought about. But also, he does certainly have a lot of detractors too. And what I have witnessed over the years is the ramping up of suppression of dissent, the terrible consequences that it can have for people who express alternative views in Kazakhstan. Going to jail, all this kind of thing. The inability to tolerate any kind of public protest. Basically just de facto making it illegal. Even one person going out to protest or to make a political statement can be arrested, can be jailed. Only a couple of weeks ago, after Nursultan Nazarbayev resigned, we saw some small protests in Almaty, Astana, and a few other cities. I was at the protest in Astana, I was at the protest in Almaty, you witness peaceful people who aren't actually doing anything, just being dragged off by the police. It's not a pleasant sight. So we can argue that Nazarbayev held on to power, and still, because he has considerable powers post-retirement, he consolidated his power through a mixture of carrot and stick, if you like. He did deliver many things to many people, including some rising prosperity really over most of the years, even if growth is slower now than it was in the oil boom. But he's also kept on to power by ruthlessly suppressing dissent. There are now no legally functioning real opposition parties in Kazakhstan. There will be no opposition in this election that's coming up in June because, Nazarbayev has driven them all out of existence. So that is the negative side of his legacy. But certainly a absolutely towering figure whose rule of 30 years is going to be, is going to go down in history for various reasons.
Now, I wanted to talk about the elections, but perhaps a little bit later. And, just briefly, you mentioned the economic situation, and I would agree that there has been a growth, and it is slowing down. And I think they tend to hype a bit, like compared to the reality, and compared to what it's been hyped, how well things have developed. So, I mean, there is a steady progress, but it seems the weakest point is the economy, and we've seen that lately. And historically, if we look at like the French Revolution, one of the reasons that happened was, when 40% of people's salary went just to buy food. And we're far from that here, but that's always the weakest point, is when people's economy is threatened. That's when they start to get angry. And, I think that's led to some of the recent discontent. And I mean, how do you see the economic situation in general in Kazakhstan, as well as compared to its neighbors in Central Asia? I mean, for me, it seems it's done better than most in the area, but maybe you have a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the question of the economy. I mean, as you say, what really? You mentioned yourself. Sometimes people are very politically apathetic, and I think that's because they are excluded from the political process. Really, it's all top down, decided from above. They don't feel they have a political voice, even if they go out and vote at elections. They're not given genuine choices anymore. But what really does bother people is when they struggle to make a living or to feed their families, to feed their children, when their livelihoods becomes difficult to find a decent livelihood, and we have seen a fair amount of grumbling and griping and discontent over these issues in recent years, really. Kazakhstan experienced an oil boom pretty much throughout the 2000s, but then things started to, slow down. And I personally, I reported on the economic crisis that hit Kazakhstan when the global credit crunch happened in 2007, 8, 9. But more recently, I think 2014 was a real turning point for Kazakhstan, when two things happened. The first was the knock-on effect of problems in the Russian economy, which came from its invasion of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, and resulting sanctions. And there was a massive knock-on effect because of Kazakhstan's close ties to Russia. And you can certainly say that wasn't really Kazakhstan's fault. I mean, it wasn't Kazakhstan's fault at all. I mean, but the knock-on effect, you could also argue, was they're too tight to Russia, and that's a problem. And of course, the very same year, just a few months later, the crash of the global oil prices. But again, not Kazakhstan's fault, but you can also argue, and many people do, that in the fat years, the government just focused too much on oil. There's always talk in Kazakhstan about diversification of the oil-dependent economy, and yet all the time programs to do this, to encourage it, and yet it just hasn't happened. So that's a big economic failing, and we have seen we saw protests around that time, and we do now see protests over socio-economic issues. And I think people, there are many people who do struggle to get by in Kazakhstan, and they find now the gap between the reality that they live and the rhetoric from the top to be very frustrating. I mean, for example, Nazarbayev has constantly said he's making life better for people, and that is true to a degree. But I think, just a few months ago, we saw these women who are mothers of large families, of many children, who are really struggling to get by protesting. And in fact, this was so striking that when Nazarbayev then fired the government, he sort of mentioned these problems of people being dissatisfied with socioeconomic discontent and so on. And so we're really seeing that now. And I think one of the problems is that there used to be a great feel-good factor, I think, in Kazakhstan, during the oil boom, which is understandable when there was more money sloshing around. But these days, I don't know, the economy is growing more slowly, and people's salaries have taken a real hit from devaluation of the currency. And that, in a dollarized economy like Kazakhstan, that means something to people. I mean, the middle classes used to, it used to be much cheaper to go on holiday for a start. I mean, that's okay. That's maybe a luxury and that's certainly a luxury many people can't afford at all. And what also strikes me very much is the poor conditions in rural Kazakhstan, in villages. The fact that there are so many villages that don't have running water is an absolute disgrace for an oil-rich country like Kazakhstan. That has constantly talked about, how well people are doing. Then I think those kind of issues, those are failings. And as for where it's going, well, I think, government forecasts and all forecasts of all international organizations, IMF, ADB, they all show really that, the growth, there's not going to be a big spurt in growth. It's going to be steady. But I think that what we can expect, people perhaps feel frustrated because they sense that there's not going to be major improvements. It's hard for people to find jobs, especially ones that pay decent wages. Wages are pretty low compared to the cost of living in Kazakhstan for most people, many people. And of course, then there's the added factor of corruption, of nepotism, of not being able to find a job if you don't have the right contacts. People find it very frustrating, understandably. So I think it might be, it's going to be a tough few years in terms of this kind of public mood. And the other thing, of course, that we can see is a political transition like the one that Kazakhstan is having to a degree now. There's going to be a new president, a president is going to be elected in June, but this does mean that people who maybe kept quiet under Nazarbayev, perhaps because they admire him, or perhaps because they were afraid, but for whatever reason, I think this does kind of give there are going to be more outbursts of disaffection. Of course, we don't know what form that will take. Public protest is not tolerated. But I do think it's going to be a difficult few years. Mm-hmm.
And what about, something you talk about in your book? You go into detail with some of the scandals, the Game of Thrones, the dark shadows, as you call it, or the Kazakh deep state, which is a popularized term. I used to use that term when I was teaching in Mexico 7 years ago, and people were just, calling me kind of crazy for using that term, and now it's become the norm. And, in my view, I feel that most countries, to different degrees, have their own version of the deep state. United States, I'm a citizen also of Mexico, and and people in Mexico know that there's some kind of power there behind the scenes, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about this Kazakh deep state or whatever you want to call it, and something you talked about that actually I didn't know about really before I read your book, Kazakh Gate, and so tell us a little bit about this.
Well, the deep state, I sort of referred to that when I was writing about Rakhat Aliyev, Nazarbayev's former son-in-law, the former husband of his daughter Dariga Nazarbayeva. And I mean, really, I only everything that we were told about Rakhat Aliyev after his fall from grace suggests that he really was operating in some kind of parallel power structures, and very sinister ones at that. I mean, trials were held without him, of course, because he was abroad, so in absentia, in which all kinds of very bizarre details were revealed. I mean, he was convicted of attempting to basically overthrow Nazarbayev, and there was all kinds of strange details revealed in these trials about how he'd been procuring poisonous isotopes, how he'd been training fighters, all this kind of stuff. When he was at one time senior in the security service, and held various other senior positions, and it all sounded like a sort of deep state, a sinister parallel power structure. And so if we are to believe the official information that was provided by prosecutors, the government, by officials, by the courts, that's what was happening. Now, what is absolutely striking, though, to me, is that how was it possible that he could have been doing this for so many years? The opposition which existed at the time was constantly raising the alarm over Rakhat Aliyev and what he was doing. All of it was ignored until the time when he fell foul of Nazarbayev. And then it was all kind of, it's to some degree dealt with. Some trials were held and things were made public. But you have to say that was an astonishing piece of negligence on the part of the authorities if this was all going on for so many years, as we were told it was. From 1991, say, till independence, until 2007, when Rakhat Aliyev fell foul of Nazarbayev. So, deep state. I mean, as for nowadays, I mean, I think we suffer from a lack of transparency about what the security services does and so on. I mean, that's the nature of the secret services. But, I think the deep state stuff was really very much connected to Rakhat Aliyev. On Kazakh Gate, you mentioned Kazakh Gate. That was obviously a corruption scandal that broke in around 2001, I guess, or 2000 perhaps, and involved basically oil contracts for kickbacks, and the whole thing ran for years. I mean, it broke in the Kazakh press because at that time there was a more robust, independent, or if you like, opposition-linked media. And it was talked about at great length, it involved an American middleman, James Giffin, and it involved most senior people in the Kazakh state, including Nazarbayev, his Prime Minister Balganbayev, and eventually an agreement was reached between the American government, the Kazakh government, and the Swiss government, where the dirty money was stashed. That this money would, the agreement was the money would be given to charity, and it was given to charity. A charity was specially set up in Kazakhstan, and by all accounts, this functioned. The money was used to improve lives in rural Kazakhstan and so on. However, it does look a bit like a tacit admission that the money was not. That was a fudge, if you like, a fudge. So that was Kazakh Gate many years ago now. But the charity, I believe, has only recently, in the last few years, been wound up.
And if people can read your book and they can see other cases beyond Aliyev. I mean, you detail other stories and scandals and assassinations. Apparently, he committed suicide in a prison in Austria, right? Mm-hmm. So there's many cases where these people commit suicides, but then again, it's like you never know exactly what happened. About the coup attempts, just a very brief. I mean, do you think there were genuine attempts to overthrow Nazarbayev, or that he held on power, that he had a strong hand for the 30 years that he was on power?
I think we've heard of a number of coup attempts. I personally think that probably the one that Rahat Aliyev was accused of fomenting, probably there was much truth in it. I mean, it's by all accounts, the people who knew him and the way he behaved, he was a very power-hungry person. So it's quite possible that he was trying to overthrow Nazarbayev and somehow seize power. I think that is possible, although how would we know for sure? But what's also very striking is that when things go wrong in Kazakhstan, it's always nowadays blamed on a coup attempt. For example, what kind of things do I have in mind? Well, in 2011, in the town of Zhangozhen, a protracted oil strike went very badly wrong and ended spiraling into fatal unrest. And the security forces opened fire on protesters, on oil workers, on civilians, and several people died. I mean, as far as we know, at least 15 people were shot dead, and one was tortured to death in a prison cell. But that, although the government acknowledged some shortcomings in the handling of the oil strike that led up to this, and generally in the conditions in that town, which were very poor, ultimately the blame was laid on political opposition, and it was allegedly a coup attempt. It was depicted as a coup attempt, and an opposition leader, Vladimir Kozlov, went to jail over it. It was blamed on the regime's arch-enemy number one, Mukhtar Ablyazov, oligarch and who lives these days in France.
Yeah, I had just about him, because he's that was my next question. And you're right about him. And today he's like, if we have Batman, he's like the Joker, right? He's like the supervillain in Kazakhstan. And, after reading your book and other things that I've read, I mean, my image of him is, I can't think that he got all these billions, so many billions, in a legitimate way. I mean, maybe, so you can tell us otherwise, but I mean, it seems like he stole a lot, and now he's preaching against, the corrupt government. So it's something like the pot calling the kettle black type of situation. So how could then you take him seriously if he's cut from the same cloth? But what can you tell us about him?
Well, this is a very murky tale, clearly. A very murky tale that's become very personal between Nazarbayev and Ablyazov, clearly. Now, in terms of the corruption case, or cases involving Ablyazov in various countries, Kazakhstan also, there were some in Russia and Ukraine. And of course, this was when Ablyazov fled Kazakhstan in 2009. This was then fought out for years in the London High Court. No conclusion was ever reached. So, although Ablyazov has been convicted of corruption in Kazakhstan, it's quite hard to argue that the courts are objective in Kazakhstan. I mean, I have to say, after sitting many trials over the years, I don't find the courts objective. So, just leaving that aside, I mean, in London, what happened? Well, the case was never concluded because Ablyazov ended up debarred from fighting the case against the bank that he once owned, BTA Bank, and chaired, because he fled the country. And why did he flee the country? He fled the UK. Well, he says that he left because there was a security threat, a threat against his life. But his departure coincided miraculously with a judge ordering him jailed for contempt of court. And the substance of the contempt of court was that he was concealing his assets and not giving a full disclosure as he was required to. The case was never fought out to the end because he was debarred. But in a related case, I mean, a judge did find in a related case that the only explanation for for some of the alleged misdemeanors was that this money was being siphoned off into shadowy accounts and so on. And so, it did imply that there was corruption involving BTA Bank and Ablyazov. That was the implication of that ruling. As I say, never convicted in the UK. But of course, there's another side to this case. Ablyazov says he's a political victim. Of course, he has been involved in opposition politics. It's known, it's a fact. I mean, his problems did start, indeed, when he became involved in opposition politics in 2001. That's when his problems started. He went to jail in a case that was, deemed by international human rights organizations and even governments expressing concern, Western governments, over, possible political motivations. He was then let out of jail, and then, of course, he was still involved in opposition politics. And so, there is this muddies the waters somewhat. And we see sort of rulings in the UK suggesting that there has been corruption, but there's also no denying that he has had involvement in opposition politics. And it's also very striking, that the selective nature of the people that seem to fall foul and end up on trial for corruption or whatever in Kazakhstan. It's often pointed out by commentators that it can be selective and that it does often seem to be another motivation. So all I can say, on the Ablyazov case is it's like a James Bond film. I mean, him fleeing, him being tracked down to the south of France eventually from the UK. I mean, because the bank's private detectives followed his lawyer and so on. It's like a James Bond film, and I think we haven't seen the end of it yet, of course. We should definitely, we also have to point out that Ablyazov spent quite a long time in detention in France, fighting a very lengthy extradition battle against extradition to Russia or Ukraine. That eventually ended when, France's highest administrative court ruled that the case was political, that Kazakhstan had, basically Russia and Ukraine had filed red notices or whatever, trying to get hold of Ablyazov at Kazakhstan's behest, and the French court ruled that the case was political.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I mean, we could continue talking along these lines, but why don't we fast forward a bit to a few weeks ago, and the decision of Nazarbayev to step down. So it was not I guess you could say it was not a surprise, but it was a shock, right? As we knew it was coming, but you just kind of never expect that it's going to come. It seems to have been planned, I guess, for they say 2 years, 2.5 years. So what do you make of the decision now to step down?
Well, it certainly, certainly came as a shock to many in Kazakhstan, including me. Not least because although we've seen a lot of movements here, especially over the last couple of years, sort of legal changes seemingly paving the way for Nazarbayev to possibly step down, it was always a question whether he would ever do it, whether he would ever be able to kind of cede power or some of his power, because if you've ruled a country, I think for this long, for 30 years, it must be quite difficult. So there was that. And also, in terms of the signs that this was being prepared, there were definitely signs, including changes to the law a couple of years ago, that again kind of gave him some powers and so on, changed the constitution to change, to make parliament and government a little bit more powerful. But we can also talk about in 2010, when he became leader of the nation, officially Yelbasi, his title, and was given the power to intervene in policy making after his retirement. There was the most enormous speculation about him being prepared to step down, and that was nearly 10 years ago. That was 9 years before. So that's why it's still a shock, even though we could see these movements. As for what's behind it, very hard to say. I guess, first of all, there are rumours put around that he's ill and that's why he stepped down. But, looking at him, he looks perfectly robust, physically, mentally. He seems perfectly on the ball. So that's just a rumor. There's no evidence for it. It's a possible explanation. But there's also, I think, primary motivation is probably he wants to secure his own legacy in his own lifetime, make sure that mechanisms are in place, that there's a change of power that's not sudden, that's not going to threaten his own legacy, and of course the security of his family members. I'm sure that's an element too. But I really think it's a legacy move. He wants to go down in history as Kazakhstan's founding father, which he will inevitably, and to make sure it's all positive for him. But of course, nothing is guaranteed in a country like Kazakhstan. In a country where power is so personalized, nothing is guaranteed. I mean, he won't be there forever. He wields many powers now, intervening policy making if he wishes to, chairing the Security Council, controlling security forces, therefore. But, at some point, everyone's mortal. And so we don't know what will happen after that. And of course, the other thing, when he stepped down, he said he wanted there to be stability and also, certainty, continuity. But all we've seen since he stepped down is a massive speculation over whether Kassym-Jomart Tokayev is the interim president, whether somebody else will come to power. And of course, the elevation of Dariga Nazarbayeva, Nazarbayev's daughter, to the chair of the Senate, the second in line to the presidency, constitutionally speaking, as another round of speculation. Is she being groomed or not? So we've seen weeks of speculation now. And of course, only this week an election was called for June, and we will see who Nur-sultan, the ruling party, nominates, and the person that they nominate will undoubtedly be the president of Kazakhstan in the absence of any legitimate opposition in Kazakhstan or legally functioning opposition. We see signs that Kassym-Jomart Tokayev is travelling today, I think, to Aktau, and so we see signs that Tokayev is being branded, and I think that's a bit of a clue.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I was going to ask you that. And the latest analysis seems to say that Tokayev will be nominated. I found it funny in your book, you predicted the name change from Astana. I read your book last night, and just a few weeks ago, they declared Astana to be renamed Nur-Sultan. Mm-hmm. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I guess. At some point, it was always somehow going to come that city was going to somehow bear Nazarbayev's name. I mean, we've heard other proposals like Nur-Astana. My thoughts are that it was very high-handed. And that's not only my thoughts, because we saw on social media, and we saw even on the streets of the city now called Nur-Sultan and Almaty, we saw people protesting about that, a few, small numbers for sure. But I think there was a lot of anger on social media, I saw, and also jokes as well. And I think people were quite frustrated with the high-handed nature of the decision. They were not consulted, they were not asked at all. And the naming, the capital after a living politician, I think for some people found that distasteful, there's no denying. Others may be supportive, but what we heard most vocally was people's frustrations about the decision and the way it was enacted. And of course, we also saw people complaining, first of all, that a lot of money has been spent branding Astana in the world, and that's true. And now it's going to be known by a different name. And we also saw people complaining that it was, it made a mockery of Kazakhstan on the international stage, Borat comparisons, unfortunately.
I think personally I would have preferred Nazarbayev City, because I'm Mexican as well, so Mexico City, has a nice ring to a Nazarbayev City. Mm-hmm. So, there's Nazarbayev's legacy, and that will continue to be debated and examined as life moves on. But, I mean, there are a lot of positive things. You mentioned the nuclear test site, the development of Kazakhstan. There are the dark shadows. Mm-hmm. And, one thing you talk about in your book, the Oral Mandar, I think you can. Mm-hmm. So this kind of return to call for patriotism, I would say like a healthy patriotism, right? And a healthy nationalism, not some extreme ultranationalism, but as a call for Kazakhs abroad to come back to Kazakhstan, as well as the renewal here of Kazakhs. And as you said, the Russian ethnic population has been declining. Mm-hmm. So the percentage of the Kazakh population has been rising. There's the issue with the language. So them learning the language, but I think it's good for a nation to regain its sovereignty and national identity. And so, what can you say about this call for Kazakhs abroad to come from China and from other countries, and this renewal of this nationalism?
Yeah, I mean that this is an interesting phenomenon. So yeah, as you say, the Worolmanda, the Worolman is loosely means returnee, although of course most of the people who are supposedly returning to Kazakhstan, many of them or most of them have never been there. They were born in other countries. When Nazarbayev announced that program immediately after independence, it was a very interesting and in many ways positive sort of initiative and also creative, if you like. Now, the official reason cited by Nazarbayev was sort of helping Kazakhs or doing the right thing by Kazakhs who were sort of blown abroad by the winds of history, including famine, revolution, war, all kinds of factors that made Kazakhs have to flee. So that was the official reason. Of course, there was another reason, really. I mean, the demographics of it. Kazakhs were in a minority in their own country, or the country named after them, let's say, because the country also belongs to the other people who live here, as Nazarbayev always makes clear. But there was also, I think that was a source of worry, especially when you have a neighbor like Russia, which was weak in the 90s, of course, but has since become very assertive, not to mention aggressive, with neighbors that don't toe its line, Ukraine. Annexing its land and also fomenting separatist trouble in parts of its other parts of the country. So I think Nazarbayev wanted to make sure that the Kazakh population was boosted, at least partly as a national security issue. As I say, it was creative and positive initiative. It hasn't always been implemented smoothly, let's say. The government has given various perks to people over the years, sometimes financial and various other ones. But there has been an integration problem that I think people didn't always expect. Mostly it's the case that when the Woromans who come from post-Soviet countries tend to have lived in a similar environment, because in many ways all post-Soviet countries have some common threads. But it's Woromans who come from other countries have sometimes struggled to integrate, countries like China or Mongolia, where they've often had a shock when they come and they don't speak Russian and they haven't realized that Kazakhstan was in, parts of Kazakhstan or in some places it is Russian speaking, and that also it's quite hard to get a job in Kazakhstan if you don't speak Russian, especially a decent job. So there have been many integration problems. Those have been acknowledged sometimes by the government. I think it was just a surprise, and also the fact is that these people, around 1 million people, have come in the years since independence. That's a big chunk of Kazakhstan's population of 18 million. And also, it's also striking. I was just thinking the other day that these people. They're Kazakhs and they've been welcomed to Kazakhstan by the government and so on, although, there has sometimes been hostility among local populations. But it's actually striking that these people would never be allowed to stand for president because there's a rule that you have to be born in Kazakhstan. That's interesting, 1 million people and they're kind of ruled out of their own presidency. And it's interesting that they don't have much political voice, even though they have some problems, common problems. I think there have been integration problems, but the Woromans they've also been praised in some quarters for being the kind of guardians of Kazakh culture and making Kazakhstan more Kazakh speaking too. Mm-hmm.
We've talked a lot about the Russian history and the influence, and I'd also like to get your thought on China, as well as, we had the Great Game. It was in the 19th century. And, I think there is a new Great Game, and you have the Russian Eurasian project, the Eurasian Union, which was the idea, they say, of Nazarbayev in 1994, I think, but the Russians have been really pushing it along. And then you have the Chinese New Silk Road, the Belt and Road project, And so you have those, you have the Russian, Russia and the Eurasian Union and the influence and their power and economy, and then you have China with the New Silk Road. And for the past century, we've had the British-American project, which, from my perspective, is that they've been kind of actively applying the Halford Mackinder's Heartland theory, trying to get into Eurasia and prevent Eurasia from uniting, which is kind of what we're witnessing now with Russia and China. And the U.S. they've had their military incursions, Afghanistan and other places. The economic influence, they've had perhaps sanctions and other ways of influencing the economy, the dollar, and color revolutions that they've used as a weapon, in my perspective. But so we've got, Russia, China, the U.S., and it seems for me that Kazakhstan has always tried to get along with all of the three powers and to kind of remain, to get the best of all three worlds, and to kind of stay neutral and not really step on anyone's toes. And so how do you see going forward this dynamic with Kazakhstan in the middle, and then Russia and China and the U.S.? And I think all three have something they can give to Kazakhstan to benefit, but then there's that danger of one or two getting like too much. So, I mean, what do you think going forward the dynamic might look like?
That's a good question, especially when we've got a change of president coming or here. I think I think this is also one of the positives of Nazarbayev's legacy. I mean, some people criticize it as fence sitting, the policy they call multi-vector, as you mentioned, getting along with everybody. Personally, I think we could do with more countries in the world that try to get along with everybody and not create problems. So I think that is a positive of his legacy. I do think it will be continued. I mean, it's been specifically stated, actually, that, foreign policy will remain the same, or, there's supposed to be continuity. We know if Tokayev does become the next president, he's a very astute and well-connected and skillful diplomat. He's a career diplomat, his position. He's also worked at the UN in Geneva as Deputy Secretary General. So I think we certainly won't see any sharp moves from a person like Tokayev if it is to be him. I think Russia and China, and to a lesser extent, certainly the US, are the main, I guess, poles of influence or whatever you like to call it. And I think that's not going to go anywhere. I think, as you say, Kazakhstan likes to kind of take what it can from all the relationships, quite understandably. With China, I think Kazakhstan really wants to leverage the Belt and Road and to try and use that to help the economy. And that's also a laudable aim. I think we hear a lot about how China's only in the Belt and Road for itself and how it's tying countries into debt. But I think, certainly the government thinks Kazakhstan's benefiting from many projects, including, especially in terms of infrastructure connectivity. Kazakhstan wants to be a big bridge in Eurasia, and that is benefiting. And the investment is not going into oil and gas. That's important for Kazakhstan. So it's an important relationship. Russia, as we've discussed, is really the major influence on Kazakhstan and also has a lot more political demands, I think, on Kazakhstan than China does. China really wants, it does try to restrict publicly its political influence or leverage. However, we're seeing that changing now because of the camps in Xinjiang, which are housing, of course, many Uyghurs, but also Kazakhs and other minorities, including Kyrgyz. So we're also seeing a bit more, I see China becoming a bit more demanding, especially because we know that a lot of what is being revealed about the camps is coming out of Kazakhstan, because this is where some people who've been in them or have relatives in them are here and they can't talk. And there's been a lot of international media, since they can't really report on those camps from Xinjiang, have been coming here. Now, we've also seen the arrest of the activist, the key activist who was raising awareness and dealing with the international media on this, Serikjan Bilash, recently in the last month. Now, there's been a lot of talk about whether that was done under pressure from China. We don't know. We know that he's being accused of incitement, basically, of calling for jihad. Although I have listened to the video myself, and he did specify it was to be non-violent. So I think what we're seeing is China becoming more demanding. Recently, a senior Chinese official thanked Kazakhstan for its support on the issue of the camps. Now that seems to be stretching it. I mean, Kazakhstan has never expressed support publicly on the issue of the camps. On the contrary, it's a difficult situation for Kazakhstan to deal with. So I think this relationship is changing in the light of these camps, and it's going to be interesting to watch that going forward. Kazakhstan's in a very difficult position. A big, powerful neighbour, doesn't want to criticise publicly, but it's got public opinion at home very concerned about Kazakhs in the camps and repression. As I say, Russia always going to be powerful and always going to be politically demanding as well. It basically wants Kazakhstan to toe the line. It sees it as part of its zone of influence, traditional, and it also, it's also concerned when, for example, countries step out of its zone of influence, as we saw with Ukraine. The US, I think there is a perception in Central Asia nowadays that the US was very active here when they needed something from Central Asia in terms of military bases in Kyrgyzstan, for example, and security cooperation. And these days it seems to be playing less of a role. And I think there's an element of truth in that. So I think there's also in sort of leading Western democracies, we're seeing so many problems that it's becoming, the idea almost of is becoming a bit discredited. And of course, with Russia stoking the flames of that for propaganda purposes.
Is there anything I failed to ask, or something I left out that you want to tell us about Kazakhstan? Something important that's on your mind? Any final thoughts?
Well, my final thoughts are that it's a very, very, very interesting times for Kazakhstan. We're seeing, obviously, a change of leadership after 30 years, and yet Nazarbayev still overseeing, controlling things. It's going to be an interesting few years ahead. I think it's important to, and in fact, we were just talking about United States, for example, Western democracies. I think it will be important for them to try and impress upon Kazakhstan the dangers of suppressing dissent so radically, if you like. I mean, I think we've seen too many trials of people for expressing their political views on Facebook, on social media. We've seen people go to jail. I think that's a sad direction for Kazakhstan to take. I think Kazakhstan should be more confident about its own people, and I think it would be nice to see a bit more tolerance of different kinds of views. I mean, unfortunately I doubt we're going to see that at a time of political transition when the authorities feel very sensitive. But I think it would be nice if the authorities also were to listen more to their own people and take account of their views and listen to them instead of telling them all the time what they should think.
Yeah, I would say the most annoying thing that I've experienced here, I've lived in 6 countries, and it's the first time I have experienced the internet censorship. Mm-hmm. And it's like, it's really annoying because random sites that you need are blocked. You need to use often social media for business and entrepreneurship, which I try, and you get stuck. It's really frustrating, and I would agree that they can, still maintain the sufficient order that they need, but they just need to, you can lighten up, guys, if you're listening.
Absolutely.
And I guess my final thought or question was, I've been here for a while. I enjoy Kazakhstan. A lot of the stuff you'll find on the internet, isn't true. When you type in Semey, you get these nasty nuclear photos, and that's just not the case. And you just have to come here and see for yourself. And so I'm just wondering, you've been here, I think, 15 years. What do you like about Kazakhstan, and what's kept you here so long? Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. I mean, I lived before that in Russia and in Uzbekistan, 5 years in Russia, 4 in Uzbekistan. So I never expected to be here this long when I moved to Kazakhstan. It was 2005 actually, so 14 years this year. I think, it's probably going to sound like a cliche, but what I really like is the people. of course, like the people in Russia too, in Uzbekistan too. But I find people here very open and very willing to talk. Also, kind of a lot of fun and easy to get along with. And so I like the people very much. I also like my work, and I think it's important. There have been many. Right now, there's a lot of interest in Kazakhstan, but I've reported on Kazakhstan over years when it was very hard to raise any kind of interest. So I think it's important to kind of shine a light on what's going on, and include positives and negatives. So I guess that's it. And of course, a very, very, very beautiful country in many parts of it.
Really big, and it takes a long time to see all of the things that there are to see, the long train rides. But again, they're developing. They just finished the airport here, and so there are new airlines being opened, and new routes. We'll be able to fly to Moscow from Samay here. So again, it's all developing the infrastructure. So go out and get the Dark Shadows, the book, the physical copy, or the Kindle. It's easier for me to just click a button and have access to it, instead of having it shipped all the way out here. So thanks for the interview.
Thank you very much.